Welcome to video number 1 for Chapter 12, The Second War for Independence and the Upsurge of Nationalism. On to Canada over land and lakes. In the War of 1812, the American regular army was ill-trained, ill-disciplined, and scattered. They had to be supplemented by even more poorly trained militias, and some generals were semi-senile heirlooms from the Revolutionary War era. Canada was an important battleground because British forces were weakest there. This map shows the Battle of the Thames, which basically is where Tecumseh, fighting for the British Army, lost his life. Canada was a target of the war hawks, and America's offensive strategy was poorly conceived and was missed by not capturing Montreal. Instead, the Americans led a three-pronged invasion, invading forces from Detroit, Niagara, and Lake Champlain. These forces were defeated soon after crossing the Canadian border. By contrast, the British and Canadians displayed great energy, quickly capturing the American fort Michilimackinac. Americans now looked for success on water. The American Navy did much better in the War of 1812 than the Army did, and American craft were better than the British ships. For example, the USS Constitution, which is now in Boston Harbor, had thicker sides, heavier firepower, and larger crews. Control of the Great Lakes was vital. An energetic American officer named Oliver Hazard Perry managed to build a fleet, and Perry's victory on Lake Erie infused new life into the American cause. The Redcoats were forced from Detroit and Fort Malden and then beaten at the Battle of the Thames in October of 1813. Despite successes, Americans by late 1814 were far from invading Canada. Thousands of Redcoat veterans had begun to pour into Canada from the continent. With 10,000 troops, the British prepared for war in 1814 against New York along the Lake River route. Lacking roads, invaders were forced to bring supplies over Lake Champlain's waterway. The American fleet, commanded by Thomas Macdonough, challenged the British. In a desperate battle fought near Plattsburgh on September 11, 1814, the Americans were victorious. The British army was forced to retreat. Macdonough saved the upper New York area from conquest, and this affected concurrent negotiations of the Anglo-American peace treaty in Europe. A second British force of 4,000 landed in the Chesapeake Bay area in August 1814. Marching towards Washington, they dispersed 6,000 militiamen at Bladensburg. They set buildings on fire, including the Capitol building and the White House. This is a political cartoon showing President Madison, who was forced into a humiliating withdrawal from the Capitol building and the White House in 1814 when the British forces torched Washington, D.C. Americans at Baltimore, however, held firm, and the British hammered Fort McHenry but were unable to take the city. Francis Scott Key, inspired as a result of watching the battle, he was inspired to write the Star-Spangled Banner. A third British assault in 1814, aimed at New Orleans, menaced the entire river valley in Mississippi. But Andrew Jackson, who was fresh from the victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, was in command. Jackson had 7,000 soldiers holding defensive positions. 8,000 British soldiers blundered badly. They launched a frontal assault on January 8, 1815, and suffered the most devastating defeat of the entire war. They lost over 2,000 who were killed and wounded in half an hour. And this was an astonishing victory for Andrew Jackson and his men. News of the American victory in the Battle of New Orleans was a great encouragement. Andrew Jackson, as a result of the Battle of New Orleans, becomes a national hero. The peace treaty is signed at Ghent, Belgium, and the peace treaty was actually signed and ended the war 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans took place. But the United States fought for honor as much as material gain, and the Battle of New Orleans restored that honor. The British retaliated with a devastating blockade along the American coast. Now, at the Treaty of Ghent, which had been proposed by the Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who had proposed mediation between Britain and the United States in 1812. His proposal brought 5 American peacemakers to the Belgian city of Ghent in 1814. The American delegation was headed by John Quincy Adams. Confident from military successes early in the war, the British had initially demanded a neutralized Indian buffer state in the Great Lakes region, control of the Great Lakes, and they wanted to have control of a substantial part of Maine. Americans flatly rejected these terms and talks stalemated. The British reverses in Upper New York and Baltimore made London more willing to compromise. England was also preoccupied with redrafting a map of Europe at the Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815, and they were still eyeing dangerous France. So the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814, and was essentially an armistice. Federalist grievances and the Hartford Convention. New England extremists proposed secession, or at least separate peace with Britain. The Federalists went to the Hartford Convention, and Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island sent full delegations, while New Hampshire and Vermont only sent a few representatives. But a total of 26 men who were all Federalists met in secrecy for 3 weeks, from December 15th to 1814, to January 5th, 1815, to discuss grievances. But only a few delegates were advocating for secession. This is a anti-federalist political cartoon showing Great Britain welcoming back its Yankee boys, which is referencing the Federalists who were going to be looked upon after the Hartford Convention as traitors. The Hartford Convention was not radical in its idea. The convention's final report was fairly moderate. The demands reflected the Federalist fears that New England was becoming subservient to the South and West, and demanded financial assistance from Washington to compensate for lost trade as a result of the war. They also proposed additional constitutional amendments requiring 2/3 of a vote in Congress before an embargo could be imposed, before new states could be admitted to the Union, or before war could be declared. Delegates also sought to abolish the 3/5 clause and wanted to limit presidents to a single term, and also prohibit the election of 2 successive presidents from the same state, which was aimed at the Virginia dynasty, which was a name for all of the first few presidents who came from Virginia, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. 3 envoys carried these demands to Washington, but arrived there just as news of the New Orleans victory had appeared. So this looked very bad for the Federalists. The Hartford Convention is, in fact, the death knell of the Federalist Party. After the Federalist meeting at the Hartford Convention, the Federalists were never again able to mount a successful presidential campaign. This shows the presidential election of 1812 and the electoral votes by state, showing that although the Federalists still held a stronghold in the North, their candidate in 1812, DeWitt Clinton, who would be the future father of the Erie Canal, did not win, although he almost did. But after the War of 1812 and the Hartford Convention, Federalists would never again put a president in office, and we'll continue to discuss the implications of this and the events of the War of 1812 and its impact in our classroom discussions.